Before her voice even broke, Ilhan Omar's violently trembling hands had already confessed her catastrophic defeat to the entire world. The agonizingly slow, suffocating wave of laughter didn't wait for a gavel or for permission. It began to fester in the dim, crowded back rows of the Congressional committee room, rolling forward with a devastating, inescapable gravity. It crashed over the dais at the exact second the Congresswoman, her knuckles bone white, her grip failing, hoisted a single, damning sheet of printed paper into the air like a white flag she didn't know she was waving. Her famously booming, authoritative voice fractured into a dry, desperate whisper as she was forced to regurgitate her own contradictory words back to a chamber of peers and reporters who had already absorbed the fatal blow of those exact sentences mere moments before. Directly across the polished expanse of the massive mahogany table, Senator John Kennedy sat anchored deep within his worn leather chair, paralyzed in absolute stillness. Two crisp white pages lay meticulously aligned in front of him, edge to razor-sharp edge, placed with the cold, surgical precision of an apex prosecutor presenting undeniable forensic evidence at a high-stakes criminal trial. A trial nobody had bothered to warn the Congresswoman she was currently losing. Kennedy didn't project a single ounce of anger, he didn't slam a gavel, and he categorically refused to raise his voice above a soft, conversational murmur. He simply tilted his chin, peered sharply over the metallic rims of his reading glasses, and allowed the slow, syrupy, deeply deceptive drawl of rural Louisiana to bleed into the hot microphone. "Take your time, Congresswoman," he instructed gently, his tone dripping with a lethal, unhurried patience. "I've got 2 pages here. I just can't tell which one you meant." As the initial, nervous chuckle from the press gallery violently cascaded into a suffocating wall of mocking amusement, Omar abruptly stopped reading, her panicked eyes darting across the text as she desperately tried to calculate the impossible mathematics of how a political titan who had built a formidable career on the sheer weaponization of fiery speeches had just completely shattered her own aura of invincibility over 2 thin, utterly unremarkable sheets of printer paper. To fully comprehend the sheer psychological velocity of this collapse, an observer must deliberately rewind the legislative clock approximately 40 minutes, traveling back to a fleeting moment when the Congresswoman still operated under the ironclad, arrogant delusion that she was the smartest and most untouchable person in the room. The hearing chamber was suffocatingly packed that morning, far exceeding the capacity that the mundane legislative schedule realistically warranted, entirely because a potent rumor had rapidly circulated through the marble corridors that Senator Kennedy had explicitly requested her presence on the witness stand by name. Along the wood-paneled back wall, the media presence was nothing short of a physical blockade. Heavy television cameras were stacked, 3 major networks deep, their tiny, unblinking red recording lights glowing like predatory eyes in the dim lighting. The public gallery was packed shoulder to shoulder, a tense sea of suits and notepads, with the overflow crowd standing rigidly along the velvet side rails, a sacred space where the Capitol marshals usually ruthlessly enforced a clear, unobstructed aisle. Tucked away somewhere in the claustrophobic 3rd row of this elite audience sat an entirely unassuming man wearing a faded, sweat-stained VFW cap, an ordinary voter who had driven 6 grueling, solitary hours through the pitch-black night just to witness this specific confrontation, though nobody in the vaunted press corps or the political elite knew his story yet, and nobody would until the dust had completely settled much later. When Ilhan Omar finally made her highly anticipated entrance, she did so in the exact same manner she always moved through the halls of power, striding through the heavy oak doors with a rigid, defiant posture that violently suggested the very architecture of the room owed her a profound historical debt. She moved with a deeply calculated, almost cinematic theatricality. She set her legislative folder down on the table with a soft, authoritative slap that echoed ominously through the sensitive microphones. Reaching out with manicured fingers, she grasped the neck of her microphone and adjusted it, tilting the metal apparatus toward her mouth by a careful, agonizingly deliberate inch. Slowly unscrewing the plastic cap of her water bottle, she poured herself a glass and set the sweating tumbler down onto the wood exactly where she wanted it, executing every single micro-movement with the exaggerated, painstaking slowness of a deeply anxious person who desperately wants a room full of sharks to watch her explicitly prove that she is not nervous. Then, she cast her piercing gaze outward over the sea of waiting, expectant faces and decided, relying on the same absolute, unshakable certainty that always governed her actions, that she fundamentally understood the psychology of every single person in that gallery vastly better than they understood themselves. When the silver-haired committee chairman formally struck his gavel and yielded the floor to her for a customary opening statement, she seized the microphone like a seasoned combatant, absolutely determined to claim the final, crushing word in a bitter argument she had been silently waging for years. "I want to say something before we start the theater," she declared boldly, her chin tilted upward in stark defiance, her eyes narrowing as she surveyed the panel of lawmakers. "Because that's what this is. I know exactly what this is." Her facial expression rapidly hardened into an impenetrable mask of pure, unadulterated condescension. "There are people in this country, and a lot of them are watching right now, who think a hearing like this is going to teach me a lesson," she continued, her voice amplifying with the cadence of righteous, intouchable indignation. "People who've never read a foreign policy brief in their lives. People who get their understanding of the world from a pickup truck radio somewhere between a church and a gun store." A small, incredibly sharp sound immediately rippled through the packed gallery. It was not a theatrical gasp of shock, but rather something vastly colder and more dangerous, a collective, involuntary tightening of jaws as the sheer, unvarnished arrogance of the insult violently landed. "And I'm not going to pretend to respect that," Omar pushed on flawlessly, a thin, triumphant, almost cruel smile now touching the corners of her mouth as she leaned into the microphone. "I represent the future of this country. The people across from me represent its past, so let's not confuse a hearing with a conversation. I'm not here to be educated by men who think the heartland is a personality." Having delivered her payload, she physically leaned her weight back into the depths of her heavy leather chair, her posture radiating an immense, untouchable satisfaction. She fiercely believed she had successfully, surgically insulted the exact demographic of rural Americans who were, at that very passing second, leaning toward their glowing television screens in the living rooms of Louisiana, Mississippi, and the frozen, rural stretches of Minnesota that had fiercely opposed her election. She had delivered the brutal blow with a pristine smile, and she fully, deeply believed it had landed exactly where she aimed it. It had, in fact, landed with atomic force, just completely and entirely outside the protective perimeter of where she had so arrogantly calculated. Senator John Kennedy did not flinch, did not grimace, and utterly failed to produce a single, microscopic physical reaction to the blatant, highly personal insult. He never did. He sat practically immobilized, his weathered hands politely and casually folded atop the polished wood of the table, his reading glasses pushed precariously low on the bridge of his nose. His entire physical demeanor radiated the terrifying, deeply unsettling patience of an old man who has spent countless, silent, agonizing hours sitting alone in a small aluminum boat, simply waiting out a fish that might not even be hungry yet. He generously let her finish her fiery, rehearsed monologue without a hint of interruption. He silently allowed the triumphant wave of applause she clearly expected to completely fail to materialize in the dead, heavy air of the chamber. He purposefully let the suffocating, unbearable silence following her statement stretch a half-second past the point of social comfort, and then deliberately let it hang for a half-second past that, holding the quiet hostage until a few nervous aides in the gallery genuinely began to look around and wonder if the senator's earpiece had malfunctioned and he had missed her fighting words entirely. Finally, moving with the agonizing slowness of tectonic plates, Kennedy leaned his tall frame toward his microphone. Defying every known instinct of modern Washington blood sport, the very first thing he did was express his earnest gratitude. "Congresswoman," he rumbled, his voice low, gravelly, and remarkably smooth. "Thank you for that. That was real educational." He purposefully let the word educational sit out in the open air for a full, ticking second, turning it over verbally like a rough, interesting stone he had casually picked up off a dirt road. "I learned a whole lot about what you think of the folks who pay your salary." A smattering of highly uncomfortable, nervous laughter escaped from a few people in the gallery before they could stop themselves. They quickly caught themselves, coughing into their fists, and the room violently fell back into a hushed, terrified stillness. "I'm just a country lawyer," Kennedy continued, deploying the exact, folksy phrase that battered political veterans knew he always used right before he intellectually and methodically dismembered a hostile witness, though Congresswoman Omar had clearly not yet recognized the flashing red warning signs. "I went to a fine school, But I learned my law in a courthouse in Louisiana where the air conditioning don't work, and the judge has known you since you were in diapers. And in a place like that, you learn there's only two kinds of questions. The kind a person can answer plain, and the kind a person spends a lot of words not answering. He paused, his sharp eyes locking onto hers over the rims of his glasses. I'm only going to ask you the first kind today, so I'm going to need you to help me with some small stuff. Real small. The kind of thing a slow fellow from Zachary can keep up with. Omar's posture stiffened with a volatile mixture of deep suspicion and lingering, unearned arrogance. I'll try to keep it simple for you, she retorted, her tone dripping with undisguised, aristocratic superiority. I'd appreciate that, ma'am. I surely would, Kennedy replied mildly, refusing to take offense. He did not immediately reach for the damning papers waiting ominously on his desk. This was the psychological hallmark of Kennedy's interrogations, a predatory tactic that those who watched him regularly knew to anticipate with dread. He never, ever lunged for the kill, while the target was still braced for the impact. He began by asking a series of remarkably small, disarming, almost insulting, easy questions. He politely inquired about how long she had formally served on the committee. He asked her, in a tone that bordered on genuine admiration, whether she considered herself fiercely careful with her public statements, or if she was the type of brave leader who spoke passionately from the heart and bravely let the chips fall where they may. He delivered the inquiry gently, sounding exactly like a genial, retired man leaning over a fence and complimenting a neighbor's well-tended garden. Omar, possessing a towering ego that categorically could not resist a question that so beautifully flattered her self-image as a fearless truth-teller, eagerly and violently swallowed the bait. I speak the truth, she declared plainly, her dark eyes flashing with renewed, absolute confidence. I don't poll-test my conscience the way some people in this building do. If that makes me a target, so be it. I'd rather be hated for honesty than loved for a lie. That's a fine answer. Kennedy nodded gently, his tone affirming and warm. I mean that. So we agree. You say what you mean. You mean what you say. You don't. What was it? Poll test it? I don't, she confirmed firmly, locking her jaw in pride. Good, Kennedy murmured, his head bobbing in quiet, terrifying satisfaction as he folded his hands just a microscopic fraction tighter atop the desk. The steel jaws of the invisible trap had just ratcheted, closed its first inch, moving entirely without a sound. I just wanted that on the record before we started, so nobody can say later that you got tricked into a position. You picked it. You're proud of it. You say what you mean. I do, Omar stated, irrevocably cementing her stance into the congressional record. Hold that thought, Congresswoman. Hold it real tight now, Kennedy advised, his voice dropping a chilling octave. With emotion so agonizingly slow it bordered on the theatrical, Kennedy finally reached down and lifted the first page from the table. He executed the movement completely devoid of any dramatic flair, picking it up as casually as a bored husband lifting a mundane grocery receipt off a kitchen counter. He read the text silently to himself first, his lips moving ever so slightly as if he were diligently and painfully double-checking to ensure his old eyes had the facts perfectly aligned. The entire room watched this silent, agonizing preparation, and the sheer weight of the collective watching built an atmospheric pressure inside the chamber that no amount of screaming or gavel-banging could have ever generated. You wrote something a while back, Kennedy finally stated, his eyes flicking up to meet hers with laser focus. Public. Your own account, with your name on it, and I'm going to read it exactly, because I don't want you telling me later, I paraphrased. He pulled his reading glasses down another deliberate, heavy notch. You said, we have seen unthinkable atrocities committed by the U.S., Hamas, Israel, Afghanistan, and the Taliban. He methodically set the printed page flat against the table surface, smoothing the paper once with 2 fingers to ensure it lay perfectly, permanently still. Now you put your own country, the United States of America, on a list, and the other names on that list with her are the Taliban and Hamas. Those are the people who hang folks off cranes and fly planes into buildings, ma'am. And you put America right there in the lineup with them, like she was waiting to be picked out for the same crime. Kennedy tilted his head up, his expression devoid of all warmth. Did you write that, Congresswoman? Or did some 6-year-old on your staff write it, and you hit the button? The hearing room plunged into an immediate, heavy, suffocating quiet. It was that specific, electric brand of silence that descends upon a crowd when everyone desperately wants to hear the incoming answer, yet is intrinsically terrified of the catastrophic fallout. "I wrote it," Omar answered, instantly injecting absolute steel into her voice. She spoke with forced pride, relying completely on the deeply ingrained muscle memory of having defended this exact, controversial statement on a dozen friendly political stages prior to this brutal morning. "And I stand by the principle behind it. There must be accountability for crimes against humanity wherever they occur, including when powerful nations commit them. That is not a radical idea, Senator. It is the entire basis of international law. The only people who find it controversial are people who believe America can do no wrong, and I have never been one of them, and I never will be." "No, ma'am," Kennedy countered gently, shaking his head with a touch of pity. "I'm not asking about the principle. The principle's a fine thing to hide behind. I'm asking about the list. You stand by the list?" "I stand by what I meant," Omar deflected, her jaw tightening visibly as she realized the escape hatch was narrowing. "That's not what I asked. I asked if you stand by the list, the actual words." "America next to the Taliban," Kennedy pressed, completely unrelenting but perfectly, terrifyingly calm. "I stand by what I meant by them," she repeated, retreating entirely into rehearsed, impenetrable ambiguity. Kennedy nodded slowly, absorbing her blatant evasion with the deep, quiet satisfaction of a man who had just been served exactly what he ordered at a diner and fully intended to savor the aroma before taking his first devastating bite. "Okay," he breathed into the microphone. "Hold that thought, too. You're holding a lot of thoughts now. I hope they don't get heavy. Because here is the fundamental, inescapable truth about a flawlessly designed political trap. It never slams shut with a loud, violent bang. A truly masterful snare closes so agonizingly slow that the victim actively helps it along the entire way, convinced right up until the final, breathless second that they are the one confidently walking out the front door in total victory. Kennedy gracefully, almost lovingly, lifted the second piece of paper. "Now," he began, his voice taking on a mesmerizing narrative cadence. "Couple days after you wrote that first thing, the heat came down on you. And here's the part I want the folks at home to hear real clear. It didn't come from me. It didn't come from my side of this room. The heat came down from your own people." He deliberately laid the second printed page down squarely beside the first one. Then, he executed a tiny, almost microscopic physical motion that every single spectator in that chamber would end up remembering far longer than the actual content of most historic speeches. Using only his fingertips, he carefully squared the corners of the two documents, lining them up perfectly parallel, edge to crisp edge, exactly like a homicide investigator setting two photographs side by side to meticulously compare two contradictory faces. "So, you put out a second statement. They call it a clarification fancy word. And I've got it right here. And in this one you said," he trailed off briefly, consulting his notes. "Your words again, I wrote them down so I'd get them right. You said you were in no way equating terrorist organizations with democratic countries with well-established judicial systems." Kennedy looked up, peering over the metallic rims of his glasses, his face a flawless, award-winning portrait of weaponized confusion. "So now I got a problem, Congresswoman, and maybe you can solve it for me, on account of you being from the future and me being from the past." He extended a weathered finger and firmly tapped the document on his left. "Page 1. You put America next to the Taliban." He moved his hand and firmly tapped the document on his right. "Page 2. You say you would never in your life equate America with a terrorist. Same week, same account, same you." He leaned back into the worn leather of his chair and dramatically spread his hands out wide in a gesture of utter, comical helplessness, perfectly portraying a simple man fundamentally bested by the laws of basic arithmetic. "So which page is the real one? Because I've been staring at these two all morning, and I cannot for the life of me tell which Ilhan Omar wrote which." That was the exact, shattering moment the laugh erupted. It was the first genuine, entirely unscripted laugh of the hearing, rolling up powerfully from the crowded gallery and breaking like a physical, kinetic wave against the front wall of the dais. A suited man seated in the second row desperately threw his hand over his mouth to muffle the undignified sound, but his shoulders shook violently with the effort, completely giving him away to the cameras. Even one of the stoic Capitol marshals, stationed strictly along the side rail, had to immediately lock his eyes onto the carpeted floor, fighting a desperate, losing battle against a breaking smile. She had brazenly put the United States on a direct list with the Taliban, and then definitively declared she would never do such a thing in the exact same week, under her own verified name, and now she was trapped between the ink of both. Omar's jaw clamped shut, forming a hard, unforgiving, furious line. She had survived highly hostile terrain before. She believed down to her marrow that she knew the complex topography of this political battlefield infinitely better than the archaic, folksy Senator Kennedy gave her credit for. When the intellectual ground began to rapidly cave in beneath her boots, she instinctively executed the one defensive maneuver she always relied on. She aggressively attempted to change the fundamental nature of the fight itself. "I know exactly what you're doing," she fired back, her vocal cords tightening as her volume rapidly and aggressively increased. She was actively reaching for her old, familiar strength, retreating into blinding, righteous anger, a psychological country where she had always felt completely safe and utterly unchallenged. This is not about a tweet. This has never once been about a tweet. This is about a Muslim woman, a refugee, a black woman, sitting in this chair in this building that was not built for people who look like me, saying things that make people like you deeply uncomfortable. Her eyes blazed as she stared down the senator, attempting to incinerate him with her glare. "You don't get to lecture me about consistency. You get to do this performance, this circus, to me specifically in a way you would never do it to a white man who said the exact same words. This is harassment, and it has a name. The name is Islamophobia, and every single person watching this knows it, whether they'll admit it or not." For a fleeting, razor-thin moment in time, one had to give her profound credit, because the atmospheric shift in the room was undeniably real. The political gravity in the chamber briefly realigned itself with her potent narrative. It was a cleanly thrown punch, a devastating rhetorical strike that had successfully landed 100 times before in 100 different Washington boardrooms, and the deeply ingrained muscle memory of the institution was still heavily present. The press gallery reacted instantly. Reporters' pens began moving at a frantic, blurring speed across their notepads, sensing the racial and religious explosion. A loyal staffer seated directly behind her nodded her head hard, twice, in aggressive, visible solidarity. A woman seated near the front row, who had been openly laughing at the arithmetic joke just seconds prior, suddenly cast her eyes downward, nervously studying her own hands as the amusement instantly froze and died cold in the back of her throat. The momentum was suddenly hers again. It belonged to Omar, fully and completely. The heavy tension held steady. You could physically feel the old, terrified reflex moving through the chamber like a live electrical current, the trained, conditioned flinch of the political class. It was the deep, uniquely American instinct to immediately step backward away from the radioactive blast radius of the word Islamophobia, rather than dare to demand an answer to the actual factual discrepancy hiding completely untouched. Underneath it, this tense, perilous standoff held for precisely 20 excruciating seconds, and it realistically might have held the line even longer had Senator Kennedy been the one forced to break it. But Kennedy remained utterly, chillingly silent, refusing to take the bait. Instead, down at the far, shadowed end of the long congressional dais, a completely different lawmaker slowly leaned his weight into his microphone. He was a Republican. He was a black man, and he had sat in absolute, unbroken, statuesque silence through the entirety of the tumultuous hearing thus far, his hands politely folded, resting on the desk, observing the circus. When he finally spoke, his voice possessed an even, almost bone-deep, weary quality, the distinct, heavy cadence of a man who had been waiting a remarkably long time for the perfect, unassailable moment to say one very specific, undeniable thing. "Let me add one thing to that," the congressman interjected, his rich tone cutting cleanly through the highly charged air. "And then I'll go back to being quiet." He locked his dark eyes squarely with Omar. "Don't you put that word on this table to save a bad tweet?" His expression was unyielding, devoid of any political posturing. "The members who objected to what you wrote were Jewish members of your own caucus. Not me, not the senator. Your own people, who heard their grandparents' history in your words, and asked you politely to take it back. You don't get to reach for race to dodge them." He paused, letting the profound weight of the silence command the room for a long beat. "Some of us carry that word for real." We don't get to fold it up and open it like a parachute every time we're losing an argument. When you do that, you make it way less for the rest of us. So please, put it away." Omar's mouth opened slightly, hovering uselessly in midair, before snapping completely shut. The emergency parachute had unequivocally, spectacularly failed to open. For a devastating unfiltered second caught on every camera, she looked exactly like a panicked skydiver who has frantically yanked the ripcord while plummeting toward the unforgiving earth, only to look up and feel absolutely nothing catch the wind. It was a breathtaking counterstrike. A member of her own party's outrage, read out loud, name by name, by a Republican, and then a black congressman publicly instructing her to put the race card away because her constant deployment of it was actively cheapening its value. Kennedy permitted the heavy, brutal silence to breathe on its own, offering her no life preserver. He was exceptionally skilled at deploying silence. In the cutthroat, hyperverbal arena of political theater, it was arguably the deadliest weapon in his arsenal. He took a slow, methodical sip from his own water glass, setting it back down on the wooden desk with a tiny, sharp, and entirely deliberate click. For 3 long, agonizing seconds, that solitary metallic click was the only audible sound bouncing off the high walls of the hearing room. "I'd be done now," Kennedy finally spoke, his voice soft, almost conversational, lacking any venom. "I want you to hear me say that. If this was the only time, I'd be done. A person says a thing wrong, walks it back, we all move on down the road. Lord knows I've said dumb things." He offered a small, disarming, self-deprecating smile. "I told a reporter one time I knew exactly how to balance the federal budget, and then I went home and could not balance my own checkbook." A gentle, warm ripple of friendly laughter cascaded through his side of the gallery, breaking the ice and resetting the room's temperature. "So I'm not up here to crucify a woman for one bad sentence. I truly am not. But this isn't one sentence, Congresswoman. This is a dance. You've been doing it for years, and you're real good at it. And I think the American people have earned the right to count the steps out loud, just this once." He reached back into his thin manila folder. Here, laid bare for anyone closely tracking the psychological warfare, was the entirety of his devastating arsenal. No massive banker's boxes bursting with intimidating files, no dramatic, colorful charts, no screaming theatrics, just a handful of thin, white pages, clipped neatly together in pairs, inherently designed to tell on the witness simply by existing in proximity to one another. He gently drew out the next paired set of documents. Years before the Taliban business, Kennedy narrated, "You wrote about a lobbying outfit, AIPAC, and you suggested out loud, in public, that the reason this country supports the nation of Israel comes down to your word, not mine, Benjamin's. Money. $100 bills. You said American support for an ally was bought and paid for." He smoothly laid down page 1. "Now, the heat came down again. From your own side. Again. You'll notice a theme developing, and so you put out a statement. And in that statement, you said you were listening, and you were learning about the painful history of those exact tropes about Jews and money." He laid down page 2, meticulously squaring its edges against the first page, exactly as he had done before. "And then, in the very same statement, in nearly the very same breath, you said you stood strong behind the criticism." Kennedy lifted his eyes, and there was something almost exhausted in his gaze now, an emotion hovering startlingly close to genuine, baffled wonder. "You apologized for it, and refused to apologize for it, in one piece of paper, ma'am. That is a genuine talent. I couldn't do that if I practiced in a mirror for a month." That is a gross and deliberate distortion of a nuanced Omar frantically tried to interject, raw panic beginning to severely fray the edges of her composure. "It's a screenshot, Congresswoman," Kennedy interrupted mildly, cutting her off at the knees with flawless, factual precision. The room fundamentally, irreparably broke. This was not the polite, stifled tittering of a nervous crowd. This was a deep, rolling, entirely helpless wave of laughter that completely hijacked the audience and flatly refused to give control back to the gavel. It was the terrifying kind of laughter that builds organically on itself, where spectators begin laughing, partly at the sheer absurdity of the situation and partly at the shared shock of each other breaking deep congressional decorum. The woman wearing the patriotic flag pin near the front row laughed so hard she physically had to remove her glasses, wiping real tears from her eyes with the back of her trembling wrist. The older man in the faded VFW cap just shook his head side to side in slow, rhythmic disbelief, a massive grin plastered across his face that he could not have erased even at gunpoint. Beside him, a much younger man who had entered the room visibly skeptical of the proceedings was now openly chuckling, completely disarmed. Even a hardened reporter situated in the second row let out a loud bark of laughter, violently caught himself realizing the camera lenses were angled in his direction, and viciously bit down on his own lip, but his shoulders continued shaking uncontrollably regardless. To her eternal credit as a fighter, Congresswoman Omar did not surrender quietly into the gaping abyss. She fought bitterly until the absolute bitter end. She straightened her spine, forcing herself upright in the plush leather chair, violently pulled the metal neck of the microphone closer to her mouth, and launched herself back at the senator with every single ounce of rhetorical fury she had left in her depleted reserves. And it was not an insignificant amount of fire. "You want to talk about my record?" she demanded, her voice dropping into a low, fast, deeply furious, and vibrating cadence. "Now, let's talk about it. I have passed legislation that put food in the mouths of children in this country while you gave speeches about catfish. I have fought for refugees who fled the exact kind of terror you pretend to care about when it's convenient for a soundbite. I came to this country with nothing. Nothing. I learned the language. I earned the citizenship. I won the seat, fair and square, in a district that chose me again and again. And you, Senator, you want to reduce all of that. A life. A whole life. To 2 pieces of paper you printed out this morning to make a video. So no, I will not sit here and be made into a clip for people who will never know my name and never want to. I am a United States Congresswoman. I have earned this chair, and I will not apologize for the size of the questions I ask. It was a staggering, impassioned performance. For a brief, shimmering moment, it was genuinely compelling political theater. Some of the supportive heat rushed back into the room on her side of the aisle. A reporter's pen or two paused in mid-stroke, capturing the raw, bleeding emotion of the outburst. The hostile current in the air perceptibly wavered, threatening to shift back into her favor. Kennedy generously let her finish the entire tirade. He allowed the full, heavy weight of her emotional crescendo to land squarely in the room. And then, he performed the final, surgical maneuver that stripped away the gentle country lawyer facade completely. The metaphorical possum scampered away into the brush, never to return. "Congresswoman," he whispered quietly. The entire room had to physically lean forward to catch the words, so deeply had he dropped his volume. "No, nobody up here is reducing your life. You came to this country with nothing, and you built something. And I'd shake your hand for it in any parking lot in America. That's not what's on trial." His eyes went completely dead and cold. What's on trial is real simple. He firmly planted one index finger squarely on page 1 and his other index finger squarely on page 2. You're not confused. You have never, once in your life, been confused. You say the thing you mean, then you watch the room. And when the room doesn't love it, you stand up and you tell us we heard you wrong. You tell the people who quoted you back to you, word for word, that they're the bigots for listening. He held his position, his fingers anchoring the contradictory truths forcefully to the desk. You're not confused, ma'am. You just hope we are. And for a long time, in a lot of rooms, we were. But not in this one. Not today. Absolutely nobody in the chamber laughed at that brutal statement. The heavy words sank into the room like lead weights dropping into deep water, penetrating right into that sacred, unnameable part of a political space where permanent, unalterable judgments are silently finalized. Omar's hand twitched nervously toward the edge of the mahogany table. "Senator, with all due respect," she stammered, frantically scrambling for linguistic footing. "We're past respect, Congresswoman," Kennedy interrupted, stating it as a cold, factual reality rather than a cruel, unnecessary jab. Respect was 40 minutes ago. Respect was before you stood up and told the folks watching at home that their hometown was a personality, and their church was a punchline, and their truck radio made them too dumb to follow along. I've been following along just fine. In a blinding, all-consuming panic, she desperately attempted to salvage the catastrophe using the absolute only mechanism she knew how to deploy. She reached blindly across the table for the clarification document, the original, heavily lawyered page 2 from the Taliban exchange. She fully intended to lift it up, to read it perfectly aloud into the microphone, to forcefully inject those careful, measured, focus-grouped words back into the suffocating air and let them perform the protective magic they had reliably done for her 100 times before. It was pure, unadulterated instinct. It was the veteran politician's ultimate evasive maneuver, a trick that had never once failed to muddy the waters enough to facilitate an escape. But her frantic, shaking hands were now hovering over both pages. The original incendiary tweet and the carefully crafted walkback had drifted perilously close to one another on the table over the course of the long, grueling morning. They were two sheets of nearly identical, anonymous white paper, and there, trapped beneath the oppressive, glaring, fluorescent heat of the ceiling lights, with the ghost of the crowd's laughter still clinging to the walls and the unblinking red eyes of the television cameras fixed securely upon her face, she grabbed a piece of paper, hoisted it into the air, and began to read. She read the wrong one. She made it exactly 3 damning words into the text that explicitly placed the United States of America beside the Taliban we have seen. Before her own ears finally registered the catastrophic error, she froze instantly. She stared down at the paper, sheer horror dawning in her widened eyes as her mouth went visibly bone-dry, desert-dry. You could physically see the moisture leave her lips. Frantically, she shuffled the 2 sheets against the desk, desperately locating the other paper, the safe one, and hurriedly started reading again. But the damage was permanently, irrevocably done. The execution was officially over. The entire hearing room had just collectively watched the single most quoted, supposedly sharpest woman in Congress physically hold up her own 2 glaring contradictions and completely fail to tell them apart any better than the self-described simple country lawyer sitting across the table. The laughter that erupted then was the absolute worst breed of laughter known to politics. It was not particularly cruel. It was something far more terrifying and final than mere cruelty. It was the uninhibited, roaring laughter of a room that has completely and utterly stopped being afraid of someone. And here is the brutal truth about that specific type of laughter, a truth Omar inherently understood in the agonizing half-second it took to physically wash over her face. Once a room permanently stops being afraid of you, you can never, ever get that fear back. You might manage to win the next minor argument, and perhaps the one after that, but the terror is gone. It does not return. There is no PR clarification for a total loss of fear. There is no page 2. Kennedy, notably, did not laugh. He simply waited for the raucous noise to slowly burn itself out, waiting patiently, almost gently, in the exact manner a seasoned farmer waits out a passing summer storm. When the room finally settled into a stunned silence, he meticulously gathered up his 2 original printed pages. He squared them one final definitive time, edge to crisp edge. "America's been awful patient with your edits, Congresswoman," he stated softly. "Years of them. We have read every single revision. We read the thing, and then we read you taking it back, and then we read you saying you never said it. And we kept reading because that's what decent people do. They give you the benefit of the doubt one more time." He laid the stacked pages down perfectly flat on the wood. "But here's the trouble with your own words, ma'am. You can't clarify your way out of them. You can only get a little better every year at hoping nobody kept the receipts." Slowly, deliberately, he pulled the glasses from his face, folded the stems inward, and set them down neatly beside the stack of papers. The room collectively held its breath, trapped in the vacuum of his pacing. "You didn't misspeak, Congresswoman." Kennedy delivered the killing blow. "You just got caught." Speaking just 11 words, maybe 10, he accomplished a level of absolute political devastation that 10,000 angry screams could never have achieved. Ilhan Omar blindly reached out for her glass of water. Her hand was shaking violently now. It was not a subtle tremor. Every high-definition camera in the room zoomed in and flawlessly captured the undeniable, erratic lack of steadiness. As she lifted the glass, the heavy rim clipped the metal base of her microphone on its way upward. The violent contact sent a single, flat, ear-splitting thump echoing violently through the sound system, a dull, heavily amplified metallic knock that rolled outward across the dead, breathless silence of the room, sounding exactly like a judge's gavel that nobody had intended to bring down. She froze completely, the heavy glass suspended halfway to her dry mouth. She stared blankly at the water, looking at this utterly ordinary, mundane object that had just spectacularly betrayed her physical panic in front of the entire nation. And then, entirely defeated, she set the glass back down on the table without ever taking a single drink. She did it very carefully, using both of her trembling hands, executing the motion with the intense, fearful caution of a person desperately putting down something they no longer trust not to explode. She folded her hands securely in her lap, her eyes dropping to the desk. She said absolutely nothing at all. The committee chairman awkwardly cleared his throat, the dry rasp cutting through the profound quiet, and formally inquired whether the gentlewoman wished to respond to the senator's remark. She did not wish to respond. That single, hollow sound, the heavy glass violently striking the metal microphone in a room so paralyzingly silent you could have heard a pin strike. The carpet was the unmistakable audio recording of a powerful political career having its shape permanently altered on live television. By the time the final gavels fell, a ruthless 40-second clip of Congresswoman Ilhan Omar frantically reading the wrong paper before Senator John Kennedy's deadpan gaze had already blanketed the internet, stripping away all nuanced geopolitical debate and replacing it with the brutal, endless loop of a nation laughing at her collapse. As evening news broadcasts cemented the devastation with a stark, still frame of Omar hoisting her own contradictions like unbalanced scales, the true political fallout was already echoing through the Capitol's marble halls. An anonymous Democratic loyalist nervously confessed that while her caucus had covered her rhetorical checks for 6 years, you can't cover a laugh, a chilling reality shared by an exhausted staffer who found herself haunted by the deafening, metallic thud of Omar's trembling water glass striking the microphone in the room's suffocating silence. Miles away, a vindicated voter in a faded VFW cap drove his truck through the dark, shedding tears of joyous laughter into the night, while Kennedy himself executed his final move by simply folding the 2 damning pages, slipping them into his suit pocket, and walking out past the frantic press corps in total silence. He had secured exactly what he came for, leaving behind an empty chair and a paralyzed Washington machine now forced to wonder if the undeniable sound of that shattered composure was merely a fleeting viral moment or the opening bell of a much larger, catastrophic political collapse.